It's a house thing. 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 It's a house thing.
Hello and welcome to Let's Talk Property. I'm Heather Hilda Darling and the show is sponsored by Callaway's Estate Agents. Now, are you as a householder or tenant plagued by mould and damp? Obviously, dampness can lead to structural damage over time, and rotting wood is not much fun either because you can get wet rot and dry rot. And obviously, the longer damp is left, the worse the problems of timber decay can be to a property. Now, a couple of years ago, Rent-A-Kill Property Care carried out a survey and found that 5.8 million British renters have experienced damp and condensation issues. You probably know what I'm talking about, some of those little black spots that appear on walls and sometimes, well, particularly outside walls and around windows. It also appears that landlords do assist occupants, especially tenants who've complained about damp, but it can take an average of up to 3 months to rectify the problem. Now, in March 2019, the government's Fitness for Human Habitations Act 2018 came into force. This means that there are now 29 criteria which a property must meet to be fit for human habitation. Some of the things we're talking about here include natural lighting and ventilation, as well as freedom from damp and condensation. There are certain properties that may not still have extractor fans in the bathroom. There are now integral bathrooms, i.e. bathrooms with no windows, so you can't open the window to let the damp outside and the condensation. And these issues have a direct impact on the growth of mould. Condensation can arise from using the shower or the bath. And obviously, sometimes if there's no window, you may not have enough natural light in your property and no reliable central heating. So to stop condensation, it's important for homes to be sufficiently ventilated and heated. Now, I have just the person we need to speak to today with me. I'd like to introduce you to Lee Browne of Bensleys. Hello, Lee. How are you today?
Hi, Heather. I'm very well. Yourself?
I'm actually okay. I'm sitting in a well-ventilated room. In fact, I'm sitting here with my window open and the radiator on, just ticking over. So I think I'm doing everything I should be doing to stop any mold and condensation in my room. How about you?
Well, I've not got my windows open and our heating's down in our office, so not fantastic today for condensation, unfortunately. And that's definitely a problem, which I need to sort out as soon as possible.
Yes. Now, I'd love to hear about your background, first of all, Lee. How on earth do you get into a topic such as damp and condensation?
Well, I'm Brighton born and raised, and I've probably been in the damp industry now over 25 years, so a long period of time. And really, it's from my father, Brian, who started Bensleys in the Brighton area sort of 36 years ago. From when I was a child, I used to go along on a Saturday morning and bang a nail and a bit of timber on a Saturday morning works. And that led me from about 1920 to start working for Bensleys full-time after college, basically.
What did you do at college? How do you actually get into damp and condensation? Are you a surveyor by trade, or is it just something that you've learnt over the years?
Well, I am a qualified damp surveyor. I've been trained for the past 20 years to diagnose dampness, woodworm problems, dry rot, specialising in that field. So when I left college, originally I was going to go to university. Unfortunately, I had a knee injury, so I was going to do sports science, which put a hold on that.
A bit
And
of a dampener, eh, Lee?
Sorry?
A bit of a dampener.
Very
Sorry
good,
about
Heather.
that. So sorry.
That's okay. That's a good one. so, so yeah, unfortunately, the university went on hold, and in that sort of interim period, I started working for the family firm Bensleys, and then from working on the tools. A couple of years after working on the tools, I decided to train as doing the surveying to help my dad out doing the surveys. And that's where I've continued for the last 20 odd years, really. I now specialise in particularly waterproofing on basements, but still deal with the massive condensation problems in properties throughout Sussex for various people, renters, letting agents, managing agents, architects, or the property industry.
Tell me, do you have a nose for damp and condensation? I mean, I think I've got a particular skill in being able to detect gas. I don't know why I can just detect gas, and I've saved many a neighbour with gas leaks. So do you have to have a nose for damp and condensation?
Well, I think you do-ish. Condensation particularly, you can have a musty smell that goes alongside the condensation. And I have to say, normally when I'm turning up on an appointment or a survey at a property, we would probably know before we're going in there if it's likely to be affected by condensation or not, whether that's the issue. Until we get in there, obviously we can't tell, but condensation can be quite common in particular types of properties. So you get the experience of going to properties and knowing what it's likely to be from the information given.
Right. So when you actually get up and go to work every morning, do you know what you're going to be doing that day, or do you sometimes get some sort of urgent calls to go out?
We do. Well, I have a diary. I do probably 6 or 7 appointments a day. They'll be booked in by my fantastic staff downstairs. So we have fixed times for that, or we'll be collecting keys off of estate agents or letting agents like Callaways and people like that. But there will be a potential phone call in the day where a basement's flooded or something along that ilk, which we may have to then have an emergency appointment. It doesn't happen often on that sort of scale, but normally our appointments are quite fixed in. They're booked in advance. The client would contact our office, and we will then arrange to meet on site or collect keys or whatever, however we're going to get into that property.
So do these calls for you to go along and look at properties, are they pretty regular over a year? So do you anticipate more before the winter time or coming out of winter just as spring starts?
So for the condensation, there's a condensation season really that will sort of run from about October to maybe beginning of March, end of March, depending on how the weather is. But condensation particularly will be more prevalent in the winter months when it's colder outside, when people close their windows a little bit more because they want to keep the heat in. We may have that extra 10 minutes in our bar to get ourselves warmed up. All the things that we do to try and warm ourselves up in the winter, but we trap that moisture in the building. So the condensation surveys particularly will run from the October, end of February time.
But what would you say you enjoy doing the most? Do you like the client contact? Do you actually like being able to detect where an issue is? What's your favourite part of the job?
I think I get to see a lot of the countryside. I see a lot of various properties. I can be looking at a 1-bedroom studio in the morning and then looking at a 20-bedroom mansion in the afternoon. So my day is always varied. I enjoy diagnosing the problems, picking out and finding the problems. So there's often dampness in buildings that people can't understand where it's come from, and often, and hopefully all the time, we can find them problems and diagnose it to remedy the issues.
So you're a regular Sherlock Holmes, really, aren't you?
Maybe a damp detective, but I wouldn't. I don't want to
A
call
damp
myself
detective. I like that. I like that.
Maybe,
I'm going to write that down. A damp detective. Fantastic.
maybe I should put that in my paperwork in future. That might
I-
be a good slogan.
So the sorts of jobs that you're currently working on, I mean, you've just said it goes from really the sublime to the ridiculous 1 beds, 20 bed plus.
Yeah.
So currently, what sort of properties are you working on? Do you work on office buildings as well?
We do, yes. I think we're working on an office building not far from your office in Church Road in the next couple of months, and solicitors where they've got some dampness in their basement.
Right.
So that's been diagnosed. We've been booked in by the client to do that works. But for instance, this morning and over the past week, I'm designing waterproofing on a major new site in Rottingdean where there's 50 plots of houses, and each plot needs a little bit of different waterproofing designed because of construction. Lift bit construction designed for waterproofing. So it completely varies from, as I say, condensation on one job to waterproofing a nice big mansion in another, in the countryside somewhere.
Now, you mentioned a couple of minutes ago flooding. How much, and I know a lot of properties are built on floodplains nowadays through our work with some of the larger developers. And I mean, even smaller developers, if they don't get all the, environmentals done properly and concisely, then there could be problems. How much of your work is divided between the condensation and damp and flooding? Or are you seeing more of a proliferation of flooding, especially as climate change is affecting us all?
But definitely, I think in the last 5 to 6 years, maybe a bit longer, the weather conditions are a lot different. I remember when I was a kid, there would be hosepipe bans because there wasn't not enough water. But nowadays, it seems to, when it rains, it rains for strongly and a long period of time. The good thing is on new basements or new properties that have been built, there's new British standards that have come in and are being updated all the time. In fact, I think they've been updated this year to take into account the waterproofing systems and what they should be, doubling the systems up, basically. I think going back 10 years ago, the most problems with new build basements was flooding. So there was a big cost involved in that. Times of year depends on the survey. So again, today I'm specing 3 new basements where the waterproofing needs to be done. But I've also done a couple of down in Bognor, a couple of condensation surveys as well. So yeah, I would say the condensation surveys are a lot more this time of year. I would say there's about 25-30% are condensation surveys this time of year, whereas in the summer probably only about 5 or 10%.
Do you have to wear specialist equipment yourself when you're going into properties? Because obviously, I mean, I would like you to give me an indication of the difference between condensation and damp at some point. But I can sort of picture you going in with masks on and waterproof clothing. Am I correct, or am I totally off the wall?
I would say that not often. I think there's been 1 or 2 surveys where the mould has been bad enough that there was a concern about the mould spores in the property, and that was a property that had been flooded, left for a long period of time, and that allowed a lot of mould to manifest in the property. Obviously, we're still really in our pandemic with COVID, so masks are still being worn anyway for that. On surveys, obviously, if I'm going to 6 or 7 properties a day, I want to keep myself safe and my clients safe. But we realistically, with the mould spores, they are problematic, particularly for people that are unwell or have got breathing difficulties. But you will breathe mould spores in walking down the street. But if they're in a building and there's lots of them, there will be mould spores more around. So it's making a risk assessment before you're going into the building, but we don't have to wear sort of protective overalls and things like that.
No, okay. Gosh, it's scary, all these mold spores and viruses going around, can't it?
Well, in America, there's lots of studies on mold spores. Unfortunately, in the UK, there's not been a massive amount of studies on mold spores and how detrimental that is on people's health. But obviously, we don't really want to be breathing in lots of spores if we can help it.
No, exactly.
Come aboard, sister.
Radio Reverb.
So let's just go back to your company. Your dad, Brian, started it over 36 years ago. Are there any other members of the family in the business?
Well, there is. So Bensleys name goes back over 100 years, actually. They originally started as a timber importer, which led them to do preservation of timber, woodworm treatments and that type of treatment. That led them to doing the damp proofing works. And then Bensleys were bought out by a big company, Jewson's, and then 36 years ago they decided they didn't want the damp proofing division, and my dad and his ex-business partner took over the company, moved it back down to Brighton, and then I started working from about 25 years ago, as I say, ignoring my Saturday morning, earning a bit of pocket money, going to a property with my dad maybe. And my brother also works for the firm. He is our foreman. He deals with all our technical waterproofing on site. He's been working for us, I would say, probably 20 years as well, I would say.
Gosh, that's a lot of awards for long service, isn't it, in the family?
Yeah, well, we're a family firm. There's downstairs we've got Debbie, our accounts manager, who's worked for us for over 26 years. We've got Becky and Cara, mum and daughter. There was an uncle and nephew that worked for us. There's another uncle and nephew that works for us. So we're a real family firm. Most of the people working for us have been working for us for at least 10 years. There's a couple of new young lads. But there's some people that have been working for us for sort of 30 years. Our oldest plasterer who's been working for us that period of time.
How would you say the industry has changed over the time you've been working for it? I mean, obviously there's a lot, we've got a lot smarter at detecting these sort of things and understanding the effect that it has on people's mental health, etc. And just the fact that it can really spoil clothes and personal items. How has the industry changed? Is it for the better or for the worse?
I would say definitely for the better. I would say when I first was working, it was a lot less technical. Condensation, you would be just telling people landlords would be tend to be telling people just to ventilate their property, it'd be fine. Just open a window, basically. Whereas now we can go into properties and test the relative humidity, i.e. how much moisture is in the air. We can measure the dew point on walls to see if it's at risk of condensation with special meters. We can take samples of plasters and send them off for analysis to see how much moisture content's in them. So I would say it's definitely changed for the better. I think people are now looking after their properties better. Landlords who own lots of properties may have in the past not looked after them as well, but now they definitely look at it as an investment and want to keep their properties in good condition. And people are more informed, obviously, with the internet. Tenants or occupants can look online, Google whatever they need to Google and find out information themselves. So you need to have the right information to give them to make sure we can try and solve the problems.
And I suppose as well with landlords, now we have these EPC ratings that we have to adhere to if we're renting out a property. It's even more important that you can identify what is perhaps contributing to a lower EPC rating than could be had if the property was being properly maintained and updated.
Definitely. It's difficult. New build construction, they shouldn't have any issues with ventilation or heating, but when you've got old buildings in Sussex and Brighton Hove, Eastbourne, Worthing, where there's a lot of old stock of buildings, it's very difficult to upgrade a wall structure that's made of, particularly in Brighton, for instance, of the bungaroosh type of walls, so flint, rubble, chalk, whatever they could throw in them. It's very difficult to warm them walls up. And obviously it's also difficult to change buildings. There's lots of listed buildings in Brighton Hove and the surrounding areas. There's lots of conservation areas, so you're limited to a certain extent of what you can do. But it's trying to sort of get that balance between looking after the buildings, keeping them watertight, but also ventilating them as well.
Exactly. Some of the risks and rewards when you go out and about, from your own perspective, Can you say how many, perhaps the proportion of properties that you go to are an easy fix? And, what are the rewards for the landlords or the homeowners when you find actually they don't need to spend thousands and thousands of pounds of money? It's something that perhaps they just totally hadn't thought about.
Yeah, it is rewarding to. Generally, people are phoning or contacting Bensleys because they have a problem. So really, we wouldn't be going round there if there wasn't a problem or a problem in the occupant's mind anyway. And I would say there may be 1 in 5 or 6 surveys a day when it may be something as simple as there's a tiny bit of condensation behind a little chest of drawers. Move it away from the wall a little bit, and it will get some ventilation and airflow to that wall structure. And then you can go to another property that may need the whole ground floor damp proofing because there's no damp proof course in there, or is a failed one, and it needs complete treatments. So it is nice to say to a client if there isn't a problem, then they're often shocked if there isn't a problem and it's a simple fix, I have to say, because most people are expecting the worst when they call out a specialist like ourselves to go and look at some damp issues or other issues like dry rot or wet rot.
Well, obviously, it's in the property owner's interest to keep their property in a fit state, isn't it? Because the more you let these things slip and slide, the more money eventually you'd have to put. It's like a stitch in 9, I suppose, isn't it?
Definitely. And realistically, for most people, the buying of their flat or house is going to be the most expensive thing they purchase in their lives. And you want to look after that investment. If you're spending £250,000 on a flat, you don't want to ruin it by not looking after it. And again, but sometimes if you're buying a flat, you're at some control of the agents or the freeholders if not that person who's in charge of it. So you've got to rely on the building being looked after. But yes, the more you look after the property and deal with the issues as soon as you can, the better it is for it. The longer you leave it, the potential is it could lead to other problems. And one of the most serious things that we deal with is dry rot. It's definitely something you don't want in a building. It's expensive to deal with. It's a messy job to deal with. We've got to use chemicals that we don't want to have to use unless we have to. So definitely looking after your building, cleaning your gutters out, maintaining it all the time is a good thing.
Now, you just mentioned dry rot and wet rot. Can you tell me the difference? How would a homeowner know the difference between the two?
Well, I have to say, if you've got any rot, I would definitely recommend you get a specialist to look at that, because self-diagnosis on rot can be difficult, and it can even be difficult for a specialist like ourselves to confirm the type of decay in a timber. The basic rule of thumb with wet rot decay is if you remove the moisture source, whatever that may be, a leaking radiator pipe, a leaking roof, in theory, the rot won't get any worse. It won't repair itself. So you may need to replace the timber, but it shouldn't keep on growing. Whereas dry rot is a particularly virulent fungus that will continue to grow in the building. It finds other moisture sources, and it won't go away in itself. It won't die off, basically, or it's unlikely to die off. But you will be really unlucky. Obviously, I see dry rot on a daily basis, but you're really unlucky to get it in a building in these certain conditions to manifest and germinate.
So is there a difference between damp and mould?
Yes. Dampness can affect a building many different ways, from leaking pipes, drainage, leaking roofs, gutters, water penetrating out around windows through walls, defective renders, or even rising damp. Whereas mould is a more related to condensation. Now, condensation it probably affects more properties than the other types of dampness as I previously described. And mould would tend to grow on condensed moisture that's formed in properties from normal activities that we all do. Us talking now, moisture is being evaporated out of us as we breathe. It's going into the atmosphere. We need to try and remove that moisture-laden air. We need to try and warm properties up. We don't want the temperature dropping too cold, because as the temperature drops, that moisture that's in that warm air condenses on a cold surface. So windows, cold walls, behind furniture. So by removing the condensation, we shouldn't have that mould forming. The mould is a result of the condensation, basically.
Okay, so things like the things that maybe tenants or we as householders do ourselves in the winter time, we dry clothes in areas that perhaps we shouldn't. I mean, I know a lot of radiators often say do not cover, and yet people put clothes on radiators. Even in bathrooms, you know, you've just had a shower, for example, you've got a soaking wet towel, and then you hang your towel over the radiator. This can't be helping, can it?
Oh, definitely not. We all do it. I do it, unfortunately.
I know. I have to hold my hand up as well.
we all do. It's difficult if you're living in a second floor flat. Where do you dry your clothes? Where do you take them? The glib answer would be to try and take it to a laundrette or a tumble dryer in the condensed tumble dryer. But it is hard. It is hard to manage condensation. Bathrooms, if we've got good extractor fans in there that will turn on and stay on for long periods of time, or long enough anyway, that will remove the moisture-laden air, that will stop it spreading around the property. But it's a lifestyle problem. If we go back to the Victorian days, we had old sash windows where there were gaps in the windows and the moisture would go around the edges, or old fireplaces in the flues. But we have double glazing in properties which seal our properties up. We don't have open fireplaces as much these days. So it's a modern problem. We've got to bear in mind, again, if we're talking about Brighton, but Worthing, lots of the properties are 150 years old. They're not designed to be lived in with big, powerful showers, and lots of cooking that we may do nowadays, more so than in the olden days. So condensation is a very difficult problem to deal with.
So if you go to see a client and you know straight away that for example, they're not opening the windows when they've had a shower, they're washing over a radiator, how do you have that conversation with them? Because let's be honest, there are condenser tumble dryers now, which you can find a place for possibly. Could be in any room, couldn't it? They could almost be in a bedroom and you tip all the water away. I'm not saying that I would recommend that, but there's no real reason to hang clothes up in a room for it to get, full of damp and everything else. So how do you have those conversations, or do you just hand out a brochure to people?
Well, no, we try to discuss with the occupant, whether it's a homeowner or a tenant, on ways they can help to reduce it. Obviously, tenants will be limited on things they can do to the actual building. So if the property they're in hasn't got an extractor fan in their bathroom, then we will be going back to the landlord or landlady or the managing agent and saying, look, if you can get an extractor fan in here to help remove the moisture, that's going to greatly help this property. But yes, if we would try and point out on site if there is towels drying on radiators and clothes. And as I say, I would say virtually every property I go in, there will be some clothes drying on something. It's contributing to the condensation. It's not necessarily the cause of it on its own, but it's adding to the condensation in the property, which then could be leading to that mould growth that may be forming on the walls or the bathroom ceiling. So to advise the occupant, look, by not having that clothes drying inside, you're going to reduce some of your condensation. It's all little bits and pieces with condensation. It's not necessarily one thing. It's a combination of lots of stuff, lots of moisture being produced from various sources, and trying to reduce all of them if you can.
Well, I'm of the age that I remember the single glazing in windows, etc., and getting up in the morning and the windows were absolutely dripping with condensation, and mum going round them all with a rag, to sort of remove all the damp, etc. And in fact, what we've done, now we've got double glazing and in some cases triple glazing, the introduction of these trickle vents is there for a purpose, is it not? And maybe some of us don't recognise what they're for, because if you stand underneath maybe a fan light with a trickle vent which is open, you do feel obviously a little bit of a draft. And perhaps a lot of people think, oh, there's a draft, I better shut that. I better keep the window closed. And in actual fact, we're not doing ourselves any favours, are we?
Definitely not. The trickle vents and windows are a great thing, and I would recommend the trickle vents are basically left open all the time in the winter, unless it's absolutely freezing outside, and then maybe open your window for 20 minutes just to get that air changed. But if you can leave the trickle vents open, that is a good thing. If you're having new windows installed, I would go to your glazing specialist and say, "Can I have trickle vents in these windows?" Or you can get the windows that are open but locked, so they will act the same as a trickle vent. So going back to wiping windows down, if you are suffering from condensation, and there still is properties in Sussex that will have, lots of properties that still have single glazing because they may be in a conservation area, they can't have double glazing. I would recommend that get into a routine in the morning and wiping them down with a towel or a rag, or get one of these fancy Karcher window cleaning devices.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good thing. But what not to do is then put that towel or that rag on a radiator and dry it on the radiator, because they're just introducing the moisture back into the room as it evaporates out of the towel. So
I think the key phrase here is a radiator cannot dry clothes and heat a room at the same time.
Oh, definitely not. No, and you're going to reduce your heat in the room as well. If you've got a towel or something blocking that heat to come off,
yeah.
If you blocking that heat, then obviously it's also making the room a little bit colder as well.
So you mentioned the Karcher there for cleaning the windows. What tools do you use in your daily life going around and checking for damp and mould? Are there some that you particularly use all the time, or particularly specialists in your industry?
So I would say probably most surveyors, not just damp surveyors, but chartered surveyors who do building surveys will have a conductive meter. So a conductive meter basically reads the conductivity of a surface. Now, all walls will have a small electrical charge in them, and when that conductive meter tests the wall, it forms a circuit, and you will get a certain reading on that wall structure. Now, there's a range that we want that would indicate it's not damp, but basically when there's moisture in that wall, the conductive meter will get a higher reading because the electricity moves around a little bit quicker, and that would indicate that there may be an issue there. So them type of meters is our bread and butter. That will be in our hand on most surveys, I would say. But we also have, in this time of year, we have a hygrometer, so that will read the relative humidity in the room or in the building. And basically, the relative humidity is how much moisture is in that air. And we want that below a certain percentage, around about 65, 70%. We want it below that. If it starts going above 70%, then that would indicate that the property may have some issues with condensation. And we've also got a surface, basically laser, that tests the temperature of the wall, which will also indicate whether it will be susceptible to condensation, whether it has a mathematical algorithm in the meter that shows where the dew point would be if moisture will form on that wall, if condensation is going to be in that room. So I have them 3 meters. We also have torches and things like that for looking in roofs and basements. But there is fancy meters where we can test the actual sample of the walls. It's called a speedy meter, which has a carbide powder in there, which actually creates a vacuum with a plaster sample and will measure a true percentage of how much moisture is actually in that plaster. So we would use that only on when it's not clear cut of what the dampness is being caused by.
If you've just joined us, you're listening to Heather Hilda Darling on Let's Talk Property, and my guest today is Lee Browne of Bensleys, and we're talking all things condensation and damp. So returning to the subject, Lee, insulation, does that have any effect on condensation and damp?
Definitely. We want our houses to be as warm as possible in that they retain the heat. We don't want to lose our heat through wall structures or through loft spaces or through windows. So the warmer the property is, the less likely condensation will form, albeit that we don't want the property too hot. We want to retain our heat at a sort of a constant level. Ideally, we want in the winter months, if we can keep the temperature around about 18 to 20 degrees Celsius, it's less likely to have condensation forming on wall structures then.
This is fascinating. I didn't know. I was wondering what sort of questions were going to come up sometimes, but I just got so many that I want to ask you, Lee. So when you go into a property, are there any particular hurdles? I mean, supposing you go in and it's an old property and they've got some of the really old furniture against the walls and maybe they've got Trickle windows. How do you overcome those hurdles?
Well, it is difficult because if, for instance, we do a lot of pre-purchase surveys. So if someone's buying a property, their mortgage may pick up that they're concerned there's dampness in the property, and they may want to have a survey done to see if there is dampness, what dampness it is, and how much it may cost them. Obviously, if we're walking into someone's property, the current owner may not want their nice sofa moved out the way for us to look at that sectional wall. So we have to have that caveat in our reports when we go back to our clients to say, look, unfortunately, we can't get to that sectional wall because of the large sofa or a large chest of drawers or a wardrobe or whatever it may be. And then that client will need to take a risk of saying, oh, hopefully it's okay, or potentially ask the owner if we can come back and move things out the way. It is difficult. If you've got an old property with Trickle windows, they're going to condensate quite badly, I would suggest. They're freezing cold. It's the moisture laden air, the condensation will head to the coldest area or coldest surface, and then that moisture will come out the air. It's a bit like when you get into a car on a cold day. You get in the car first thing in the morning, like I did this morning. It steamed up. I sat in my car for 5 minutes with the fan and heater on, and it clears. We need to do that on a grander scale, really, in our properties.
Well, I left the car at home this morning and decided to walk into work instead. I thought it would probably be quicker.
Well, in traffic's not great, is it?
I'm sure a lot of your work involves project planning. How on earth do you go from, going round to see the client, agreeing with them that something needs done, and how do you then go about planning the project? It can't necessarily all be done at one time, presumably. You may have to do it over several weeks or months. Can you just explain a little bit how that works?
Well, yes. So, as you know, say, for instance, a property is in a basement area, it's below ground level, and it's affected by penetrating damp from the pavement. There will be the initial step would be obviously the client asks us to go around to diagnose that. If they're happy with what we're saying and want to go ahead with that works, we will get them instructions. From them, we will look into our work schedules and see when our next available dates are. Liaise with either the homeowner if they're living there, or if it's a landlord, or normally often with the tenants, because obviously they're the people that may be living there, and what's convenient for them. We would explain basically the timescale. So it can take anything from 2 or 3 days to a month worth of work, depending on the size and scale of the job. And it's explaining the different stages. I have to say the works are not easy. They're disruptive. If we're working in someone's bedroom, realistically, that bedroom is out of use whilst that work goes on. There's drying times in between different layers of materials, different membranes, different plasters, and they all need to cure before you go on to the next step. So it's explaining to the clients of the limitations of that room, what we need before we get there. Obviously, if they've got in a kitchen, they're not going to have their kitchen for a couple of weeks. They may need to come out. So it's trying to manage that expectation of works. We're quite used to we're quite obviously we're doing this all day every day. We may start 10, 11 jobs per week, so we follow a particular sort of schedule on them lines. So it's easy for us to do it. It's difficult for the people living there. For us, it's our daily job. Although I'm not actually doing the works, obviously I'm only doing the surveys. For the occupant, it's hopefully a one-off for them, and it can disrupt their lives quite a lot, I have to say.
Just a bit of a break from the norm.
Radio Refurb 97.2 FM.
So what are the daily highs and lows that you get in your role?
I think the daily highs are obviously we are a business. We want to make money. We want to get work in. but it's got to be the right work and it's got to be the right diagnosis. We're professional, we're honest, we want to make sure we're diagnosing the initial problem correct firstly. That's the most important part of it. And the satisfaction at the end of a job where you may be converting someone's basement from a store area into a big cinema room. They may be using it as another bedroom where their family's grown. In London particularly, they are excavating houses a lot downwards instead of going upwards, which was traditionally sort of 20, 30 years ago, people would convert their loft spaces. Now in places like London and in Sussex, it's getting bigger and bigger, where people are digging down and having a basement room, a games room, or as I say, just a bedroom or a bathroom. So it's expanding them houses, which is a good thing. It's using space.
And the lows?
The lows can be anything from, particularly this past couple of years, you may turn up to do a job and get a phone call the night before, and the tenant or the homeowner has COVID, and you have to then find other places to send them operatives or plasterers elsewhere. You can start a job one day, and the following day you can't go back into the site because there's a COVID outbreak, and then that person's left with half a job done until the isolation period, which I know is now cut down to 5, but it's still a long period of time in between jobs. Basically, it's a fun job to do. I get to see lots of different places. I've been in the Brighton Dome. I've been in the Royal Pavilion to do surveys. I've been in lots of old churches, 1,000-year-old churches. So it's a very varied day. No day is the same, I would say.
Well, I was down at Glastonbury last weekend, and the Glastonbury Abbey, which had been sort of pillaged years ago, I tell you, the bricks there looked absolutely fantastic. Apart from a few weeds growing between the bricks, it didn't look as though there was any damp there at all. So we really need to...
Yeah. The older buildings, I have to say, are built very well. We have a problem with buildings sort of from the 1970s to the mid-85, which are not so well built. And now the British standards are all much better. There's a much more thorough inspecting of properties to make sure they're built properly. But old stock houses are very good. The Victorians are very good builders. The Edwardians were very good builders. They're all good buildings, but they can suffer from damp issues, unfortunately.
Now, I think the fact that you've said that obviously lockdown has affected your business, and I think it's made it very difficult to plan ahead. I mean, all you can do is do what you can do, basically. Has it made you perhaps change your modus operandi? Have you introduced different kinds of software? You're a business like, any other business, really, and a lot of us have had to adapt. How have you adapted over those last 2 years?
It has been difficult. I think the whole construction industry has suffered and prospered, a bit of both, I would say, in that the people are now looking at their houses, and when they spent a lot of time, like I did in the first 6 weeks of lockdown in 2020, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Where you're in your house, stuck in your house, you're looking at things and thinking, oh, is this going to happen again? Should I improve my house? Should I make it better? Because we're worried that it may happen again, lockdown. Hopefully not. So I think people are now looking at their houses more as an investment and looking after them better and extending them and making them better, which would include if they had a damp problem where they may have sat and looked at it for 6 months, wanting to finally get that done or dealt with. Software-wise, our industry obviously is quite a people person. We have to be personable with people. I have to go to people's properties realistically to diagnose the problem. Whilst I can look at photographs or maybe a video, it's not the same as doing an on-site visit. But there is a lot more works where we do from tenders. So it may be a new build tender where I can diagnose or specify a waterproofing system without going to site. From our operatives also, where we would previously have them in every day, give them paperwork, we now can send their plans to their mobile phones. The reports will be sent to their mobile phones if they're going to a client. So they don't necessarily need to come to the office as much as maybe they would have done 5 years ago or even 2 years ago.
Yeah, no, I think we've all had to adapt so amazingly. And I think it's come as a bit of a surprise to many of us that how quickly we did manage to adapt. And certainly, in your line of business, you still need to have that personal relationship with people, because actually you might be giving a homeowner bad news regarding the cost of improving something that you don't feel as though there's a benefit in it. Of course there is, because the property remains far better structurally, but telling somebody they've got to pay out, I don't know, what would the average damp solution be, or is that too difficult to say?
Well, it can be anything from £400 to tens of thousands of pounds.
Exactly.
When we often get asked, "Oh, could you tell us how much it would cost to damp-proof this house?" But without seeing inside the house, it's difficult to give a price without being there. We can give meterage rates, but again, they're so varied because you don't know the fixture and fittings you need to remove. They may have a £10,000 kitchen in front of the wall that needs to be taken out. To nothing taken out. So it is difficult. You really have to go to the properties, and as Callaway's have done before to us, can you tell us what this type of dampness is? From a picture, it may be a bit of mould on the wall, and it may just be condensation. And I say just, but condensation is not necessarily easy to deal with, but it may also be other issues. It may be a leaking downpipe or something that we can't see from that photograph. So we do prefer, in most cases, to go to site so we can get the right diagnosis and give the right prognosis of what needs to be done to fix it, basically.
No, I understand the difficulty. It's like, when you get a building quote, very often the builder will say, well, it's going to cost X, but if we find there's X, Y, Z behind it, it's going to cost even more. So moving on, if you could wave your magic wand, or maybe I should be saying if you could wave your hygrometer, what would you do to change or improve the industry at the moment?
Well, I think it is improving. We Bensleys are members of the Property Care Association, which is the trade association for damp proofing and wood preservation. It's been around a long time, but they have lots and lots of code of practices that we have to adhere to. Training, basically, education and training for the operatives, the secretaries who work here. They're brilliant. They could possibly give a diagnosis over the phone and say, "Oh, it may be this, but we need to obviously go out and have a look." But I think education and training is the most key in all construction, I think, or any walk of life these days.
Exactly. And what would you do to encourage people to join this industry? I mean, it's certainly not, well, if you've got an interest in water, come and join us, is it? So what sort of benefits would you give to people about joining an industry such as yours? Would they have to have a chemical background, or just learn on the job, as by the sound of it you did years ago with your dad?
I did some training. Well, I did lots of training when I was younger on the tools, where I would go to we're approved contractors for many manufacturers, and they would take us to their factory and train us how to use their products, applications, or even come to site. They often came to site to do on-site training, and that still happens with our guys. As I say, most of them have been working for us for a long period of time, but there is 2 or 3 young lads who joined us last year, and they're training on the job at the moment. They're on a sort of a 6-month period of seeing if they like it before we start sending them off onto proper courses as such. You can get MVQs for damp proofing technicians through the Property Care Association. So it's an interesting job. As yours is, you go around to see lots of different people, different properties. If you like speaking to people, then you will be talking to. I meet 6-7 new people every day generally. I will meet architects and clients. I'll go into a muddy site and not want to go on there. It's
so a good pair of wellies is absolutely necessary. Yes,
definitely. I was standing on the site in Rotterdam the other day when the wind was howling across, and I was waiting for the architect to turn off freezing. And then we went into the nice warm site office. So I wish you had told me that about half an hour before, because I would have just waited in there. So yeah, you get to go to lots of different places. Your day will probably never be the same, and we have quite a few nice benefits of Bensleys. We're quite a relaxed company, quite a friendly company.
That's lovely. Now, do you know what, Lee? We've been chatting for so long, I hadn't even noticed the time. But I know. But let's just to sort of, as before we close off and we find out where people can find you if they've got an issue they want you to look at. Just imagine that tomorrow you're called into, it better be socially distanced still, I think, a government meeting to discuss issues caused by poorly built or poorly maintained property which are susceptible to mould or damp. So what would your top 3 recommendations be to the government to start implementing maybe different standards or different things that they should check beforehand? If you could just give me your top 3, that would be great.
Well, it depends really. If you're looking at new build construction, in theory, the ventilation heating should be top standard. So there shouldn't be any issues on new build in theory, as long as it's implemented right by the main building contractor. But if you're looking at properties in Sussex, so anything from Littlehampton, Worthing, Brighton, Eastbourne, there is a lot of old stock of properties. So it's very difficult to upgrade wall structures that are solid walls that you can't upgrade necessarily easily or cheaply. But if we can insulate our properties better, as much insulation and a high grade of insulation in loft spaces, on wall structures on the inside potentially, or even on the outside, you can put insulation on the outside. If we can get good windows, good double glazing, good ventilation in them windows, so triple vents as we discussed earlier. Extraction of air in bathrooms and kitchens is essential. So building regulations these days, you have to have them in new properties. But obviously in an old building, it's not necessarily you've got to have them in there. But retrospectively, I definitely would recommend them. And the best ones you can get, spend a little bit more money on a humidistat control fan that turns itself on and off. Without you having to remember to turn your bathroom light on and off to turn that fan on would make a difference. So it's trying to do all them things. There's simple things that owners can do. Even putting a bit of cold water in your bath before you fill it up with warm water, that reduces the steam massively. But ventilation, heating is the most important criteria with properties to reduce condensation particularly.
Wow, I didn't think I didn't realise you'd come up with quite so many. I think that's fabulous. Thank you. And I'd never heard that one before. Cold water in the bath first.
Cold water in the bath.
That's a pretty simple one. I always put the cold water in afterwards. So I've obviously been doing that wrong for many, many years.
Well, it just reduces that steam where the cold water is in there. A little bit of cold water in there first will reduce that steam a little bit in the bathroom. Hopefully, you've got a good extractor fan in there that will get rid of that steam anyway.
Well, I will have when my blooming extension is finished. It's still waiting to be done.
Good luck with that.
Now, Lee, it's been absolutely fascinating talking to you. I've still got loads of questions that maybe we'll have to come back again another day and go through them. But obviously, I'm sure my listeners will have lots of questions as well. And maybe they've got damp issues that they haven't even thought about getting sorted. So can you give me some of the contact details and your website address so, we can get in touch with you?
So our website is www.bensleys, which is BENSLEYS.co.uk. You can email us at admin@bensleys.co.uk. Contact number, nice easy one, 01273 600 700. So any of them will be easy contactable on us. We're open from sort of generally 9 to 5, 5 days a week.
And are you on any social media at all?
We are on Twitter. So that's at Bensleys with a capital B, I believe. And then we're also on Instagram. That's Bensleys Ltd. And I believe we're on Facebook as well. My secretary, Becky, runs that site for us. But you can find us on Facebook as well.
So there's no excuse for not getting that damp and condensation sorted out,
Definitely not. Definitely not. Any issues, just come to us.
Lee, it's been wonderful having you here with me today. So thank you to my guest, Lee from Bensleys.
Thank you,
Lee,
Heather.
thank you ever so much. This is Heather Hilda Darling at Let's Talk Property on Radio Reverb 97.2 FM and DAB.
It's a house thing. It's a house thing.